Thanks very much, June. I'm going to turn it over to the audience, but I wanted to give one short anecdote which is related to your excellent talk, and that is I attended the August 2004 Asia Cup final match, which seems relevant today because of the World Cup going on. And it was China and Japan, I think, which was a nightmare for the Chinese government, that it happened to be China and Japan, neither of whom were supposed to be in the final. And it also ended on a penalty call, and a controversial call where the Japanese player clearly hit the ball with his hand and then kicked the ball into the goal for the winning goal, which is probably even a bigger nightmare for the Chinese government. But the Chinese government had prepared for this in two ways. One, they had sent a larger number of People's Armed Police and regular police forces to the area than they did before the Tiananmen crackdown. It was 90 degrees out, and they were in full body gear. It was really, first time I ever felt sorry for the Chinese security forces. And the second thing they did is they put up all the big propaganda posters about peace and harmony in the region and love and unity and all these other things. Well, the crowd was chanting something besides love and unity at the Japanese team, all in unison, and everybody but myself and maybe 7 other foreigners who managed to buy non-fake tickets and actually get into the audience. So I was there with my friend who speaks Chinese as well from the United States and 2 French people who don't speak Chinese. And they were begging me to translate what the crowd was chanting over and over again. But it was so obscene. And there was a woman. One of the French people was a woman, and I'm a traditionalist, so I didn't want to translate what the audience was chanting at the Japanese. And she finally convinced me, and then I translated. It was a no-win situation, and she said, "You probably shouldn't have translated it." So there you go. And that was not love and harmony, and it was not peace and unity. So those emotions are very real in Chinese society, and they couldn't have orchestrated this. This was the real deal. This was spontaneous. I have 2 questioners on my list already. I would ask the questioners to play Jeopardy and pose your question in the form of a question for the audience rather than to make a speech. And the first on my list is Bud Cole.
Thank you, Tom. This question is for Dr. Ratner. Thank you.
I think it was on.
This question is for Dr. Ratner. In January 1994, I was at China's National Defense University and asked one of my interlocutors what he thought the threats to China's national security were. And I asked the same question in May of 2008. In both cases, Japan was number 1. In other words, they named questions, not the threats that you've so accurately named here. In 1994, the second threat to China's national security, this fellow named, a senior colonel, was Russia. In 2008, Russia was no longer mentioned. And I wonder about your thoughts, given the long history of antagonism between Russia and China, the recent almost zeroing out of Russian arms sales to China, economic uncertainties in Russia and China's desires for relying on energy supplies from Russia. Do you think that the current state of relatively friendly affairs is transitory, and that sort of deep down China still considers Russia to pose possible threats for the future?
Well, that's obviously an important question and a difficult one. I think, just to step back just for a second, obviously there are a set of state threats that China is very worried about and that China may have to deal with as they relate to obviously Japan, Taiwan, and the United States, certainly India, and then sort of, like you mentioned, possibly Russia looming in the background. That is not an issue that I have studied in depth, but I have looked at China's role in Central Asia. And as far as I can tell, there seems to be sort of a distribution of influence so far, where the Chinese are very active on the energy side and the economic side, and have thus far left the predominance of the security oversight to the Russians. So I think in terms of thinking about flashpoints, that would be a potential issue area, particularly with the instability we're seeing in Kyrgyzstan and other places in Central Asia that under perhaps very more dramatic circumstances could draw in actors in the region. So I think it's worthwhile. I would be interested in hearing maybe Chris and others' view on this, given thinking about some of the nuclear dynamics. But I think as things stand right now, I would not consider it sort of a flashpoint.
The second person on my list is Dan Blumenthal. I'm going to take great pleasure if he asks June a tough question, because they both did their job on the Economic and Security Review Commission, asking tough questions of people like me. And I always wish, like, why don't you just argue amongst yourselves? So here we have an opportunity. Maybe you'll ask a question of June.
Well, I'm not going to take up that challenge. I'm also having trouble posing a question in Jeopardy form because I think you're supposed to give the answer first. But
Well, at least do it the British way and end your
so
statement with, isn't it?
I'm going to ask a leading. Yeah, isn't it true? I'm going to ask a leading question based on my past legal training. Dr. Ratner, I thought it was very thought-provoking and well-argued presentation you made. I would say that there's a couple questions. There's a rich literature, in certainly on American foreign policy, on so you mentioned American foreign policy in 2000 and so forth, that says basically that the sources of American foreign policy and the impulses were all there already before the decisions were made, and perhaps different presidents and different groups of people would have made different decisions. So it's not. I don't mean to make it sound like you made a deterministic argument, but the source, and then there's a rich literature of which Tom Christensen contributed to on sources and influences in Chinese foreign policy, domestic politics and Chinese foreign policy. So one of the questions I had is, you mentioned the fact that the Chinese will have all these new threats, which I agree with you, and I think that's driving a lot of their thinking about military modernization. But I think there's a first order question, which is, why are they in those places to begin with? So in other words, they now have investments and people all over the world. And you mentioned that there's sort of a logic to international powers rising and so forth. But isn't it true
There you go.
that there were policymakers in China for a variety of reasons that made deliberate decisions about how to go about acquiring resources and doing other things, have certain perceptions of places like Japan and the United States, isn't it true that they could have made other decisions that therefore wouldn't have posed these threats as you described them?
Okay, so I think there are a couple different questions embedded there. Just to the last one, could they have made, I sort of hear two questions. One, could they have made other decisions that would have prevented these threats from potentially rising? And the other one, why haven't we seen them reacting to these potential threats yet overseas?
What I'm trying to say is, isn't it true that there are sources within the Chinese government, within Chinese domestic politics, that lead them to make the decisions in the first place, and then they have to react to them? So it's not. So in other words,
Seeing it's an interactive thing. They make decision A, then there's challenge B, and then decision A makers react to it.
So what you posed is essentially that a lot of us are incorrect in saying there's some grand master plan, and which I don't tend to believe, but really the threats that the Chinese think about are in fact structural, embedded in the international system. And I'm saying, well, they chose to go out and become part of the international system and take on those risks. There were debates about whether or not to do that, and now there are debates about how to deal with that. So in some ways, isn't it true that poses some questions about the basic argument that you make?
Yeah, well, I think we're talking about, in a sense, you're talking about competing priorities. So decisions were made to go out and seek resources from some of these countries, I think probably with the understanding that there was significant amounts of risk involved in that. And I guess the point I'm making is that it seems like the priorities that are driving those decisions, that are driving these relationships in some of these potentially unstable regimes, in oppressive Muslim governments, are so immediate that even if decision makers in Beijing see the potential for these threats, at this point they can't say, well, we're going to stop then. We're not going to build relationships with Iran and Saudi Arabia anymore. We're not going to try to build relationships with Egypt. We're going to get out of some of the sort of mineral and resource-rich countries in Africa. I don't think they have that choice given the resource needs that they're facing. And, we see the same thing in this country, in the U.S. The U.S. relationship with Egypt at some point is going to come back and absolutely sting us. And we know this. And you know what? We're kicking the can down the road, and it's the same thing with Saudi Arabia. And perhaps we're going to find some miraculous way to unwind these and resolve these problems. But I think it's a matter of dealing with really emergent, or really immediate problems in a way that is going to lead to future emergent threats. Sort of a short-term, long-term trade-off.
Okay, I'm going to take two at a time now because I have 4 on the list, and there's going to be more apparently. And I had John Corbett and is it Martin Murphy? Is that correct? Those two first, and then I'll move on from there. I've already got 2 others, and I've got Randall Davis.
I'll keep it very quick. For Professor Toomey, I really like the way you broke down your study, particularly the divergence of views among different countries on the utility of nukes and things like that. Do you go in, or would you care to go in to postulate what are some of the thresholds that these different players in Asia would be using or having in terms of consideration when they would actually use the nukes? And that's something I'd be looking for in your study.
Okay. Mr. Murphy, we'll try to couple of questions so we can get more on the table.
Yes, Martin Murphy from the Corbett Centre. There's another question for Chris Toomey. As I'm British, I'll play Jeopardy and come up with a British question.
Excellent.
The picture you point to of the complex security environment in Asia seems to raise important questions about the US posture. And the British thing is, doesn't it?
Thank you. And you said with the right accent.
What various options and pictures or even conclusions does your research reach?
I mean, both are great questions, and I think to some extent my answer is I wish I had a better understanding in both cases. To John's first, I would say we need to recognize that there are different levels of use. One is actual explosion, and 2 is nuclear bluster. And we used nuclear bluster throughout the early part of the Cold War to great effect. The North Koreans think they are using it to some effect now. They certainly are attempting to use it now. And I think that is likely to be more commonplace as you have states with different degrees of different perceptions about the role of nuclear weapons. That interaction is going to lead to some players thinking they can get away with coercive utility in one way or another. Not just in the North Korean fashion, but also in the Pakistani fashion. The great presentation yesterday on the cold start doctrine for India, for some of you who may have seen that, I think speaks to some of these same issues. In terms of actual detonation, because you have different levels, because they're serving different purposes for different countries, I think actual use is more likely. When you have 2 sides understanding it in a similar fashion, it's less likely because you understand the other side better, right, in a Jervisian perception sense. It goes back to some of my other work, which is why Tom's smiling.
Because I was Jervis's student, so it's always nice to hear Jervisian.
Right. I don't know what to say about American. Certainly the United States is changing dramatically in a couple of different ways. The drawdowns, the current administration's desire to change the arms control dynamic is one important. The continuation of the Bush administration's desire to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, I think, is in overall strategy is resonating with this administration in ways that it didn't with the previous administration in the region, and I think that's going to have a somewhat positive effect. On the negative side, the missile defense simply complicates matters. I'm not saying it's not in the American interest to do so, to pursue that vigorously, but it does complicate the calculus in ways that I think is just hard to resolve for other countries. And I certainly spent a lot of time working on China, but it's not just China that this is a problem for. So the U.S. is in the middle of this as a leader in some of the technologies. I wouldn't give us a pass by any means.
Okay, my next 2 questioners are Tom Fingar and the gentleman behind Bob Suitinger in the yellow jacket.
Excellent presentations. I compliment all of you. My question is for Eli and Chris, and it comes down to what are the diplomatic, political, economic, non-military sort of responses to the situations that you describe? Each of the ones you describe has implications for military development and strategy and alliance formation and so forth. But there are a whole lot of other tools in the toolbox. And I wonder if you would care to speculate on either China-specific, where does the military tool component of this fit in the larger framework, and for Chris, the regional reaction, since of the multiplicity of this. One more wrinkle in that, besides the kind of threats that Eli described as existing out there, there are also, I think, from the Chinese perspective, some responsibilities, the P5 kind of stuff, the anti-piracy, the good citizen of the world, the not being a free rider that may kick in, and the other opportunities to deal with some of the problems through the use of partnerships and the like.
Right over here.
Yeah, Bill Jones, Executive Intelligence Review. My question is to June Dreyer regarding possible U.S. role in dealing with the problems between China and Japan. It seems to me that over the long term, it's going to be difficult for them to avoid some form of conflict, as you yourself indicate, without some kind of outside influence there. The high point of the U.S. policy, I guess, was when President Grant left the presidency, went to Asia, and was asked by Li Hongchang on China and by the representatives of the Meiji Emperor to mediate the island issue, which he did successfully, and they didn't have a war for another 12, 13 years over the issue. Now, we've come a long way from that, but nevertheless, it seems to me that the U.S. having a presence in the Pacific, and because the Chinese see the U.S. as the most important partner, they would have an influence that nobody else would have. How do we get ourselves into that position with regard to the Chinese-Japanese relation? Is this a possibility?
Thank you. We got those two questions on the board. I have two more lined up, and I'm not going to take any. Yeah, I've got you in the back. So we have two more lined up, and I'm going to close it down there. Could you give brief answers so we can get at least the two questions out, even if we don't get the two answers to the questions out on the table, so that everybody gets their concerns raised?
June, do you want to start?
Sure. To your question, I would ask another question, which is why on earth would we want to get involved? I don't think our other efforts in intervention were particularly successful. I know something about the background of Teddy Roosevelt serving as a moderator in the Sino-Japanese War, and it turned out that the Japanese had that in mind before they started the war, because he and one of the negotiators had been a classmate of Teddy's as an undergraduate way back when. And he is not regarded as actually having done a good job from the Chinese point of view of moderating. The other thing is we wouldn't be regarded as an honest broker because we have a security treaty alliance with Japan. So I think that probably the best thing to do would not even consider getting involved in that. It's not like we had nothing else to worry about.
Chris and Eli on Tom's question? Briefly,
I'll take a crack at it. I'm assuming you meant sort of Chinese diplomatic economic response. The question of American responses to some of the issues I raised, I think, is an incredibly thorny issue that would require a much longer discussion. Just real briefly, I think I think China is using diplomatic and economic resources to try to ameliorate some of these threats. In some of the ways, they're doing it better than some of their Western predecessors, focusing on sort of larger, more visible infrastructure projects or otherwise, looking at economic, not just political change. I think the big question is, can China alleviate rising anti-Chinese sentiments, popular sentiments, without advocating political liberalization in these countries, without facilitating and advocating some sort of political liberalization. And I think unless they turn to that, which I don't see how they can do, given their obviously domestic situation, I see that as sort of the real way out. Whether they can do it through just economic development, I'm highly suspicious of.
Briefly, Tom, it's a great question. I think one of the answers is there's a lot less room for the traditional diplomatic toolkit to address some of these issues. And I have become increasingly pessimistic about the utility of the NPT regime writ large and ancillary institutions that support it to address the new nuclear age in Asia. One of the ways that one might try to go about it would be to reduce the inability to understand your neighbors in terms of how they deal with nuclear weapons. And so dialogue. We should have more dialogue. That's really hard for the Chinese. They just don't do that on these issues very well, and I say that as somebody who spends a lot of my time trying to engage them on that discussion. There is some degree of incongruity between their stated public doctrine and some of the ways in which countries around them certainly think about using nuclear weapons, and that means that discussion just stops very early and isn't very productive. So I think in the long term, that's going to work against their national interests. Am I optimistic that they're going to realize that in a time that might allow them to move away from that? I'm not.
Okay, I have two more questioners, and I don't know if we're going to have time for answers, but I'll at least get the questions out. First is Randall Doyle. That's you, sir, right? I'm only reading your name tag, so I assume.
Oh, okay. I was listening to all your intake, and I was a little concerned, maybe because I'm a historian, maybe I teach this area, but it seems like these three countries in Northeast Asia, China, Japan, and Korea, have had a history of isolation from the outside world, and even today, in my travels through there, I've lived in the region for 10 years, there still seems to be kind of a strong skepticism about many of the things that has been brought to these countries. For instance, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank. There's a strong suspicion in all these countries, in essence, they see these as Western institutions. And in the 97-98 financial crisis and other events and so forth has kind of reinforced some of these things. But one of the things that really bothers me, though, is that we're trying to create strategies. We're trying to create, in prior sessions, these kind of architectural alliances, things of this sort that they've mentioned. But there's so much unresolved history in this region. And for some reason, we kind of talk around as like it's like the unwanted relative at Thanksgiving or something, or the 800-pound gorilla in the living room. And until there's some kind of resolution, I think, with this history, that even though it has been mentioned, for instance, that these countries are trading amongst each other, they're making a lot of money with each other. June, I go in these stores, I go in these stores, I find out half the stuff is all made in China and Japan and so forth. But it still doesn't, I think, negate the painful history that exists between all three of these countries. And I think until there is some kind of resolution with all these countries, I think that any type of architecture or strategy trying to be implemented to bring stability to this very volatile area of the world, it just won't hold up.
Okay, thank you very much. You have one more in the back, the gentleman in the white shirt in the back. And I don't know if we'll have time. I think June did address the history issue, and I think that's I think you make a very excellent point. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. This question is for Eli, and perhaps Chris could also step in if there is time for response. The question is this, that you've actually talked about Chinese support for unstable, despotic regimes. I'm just curious if you could sort of unpack that, specifically about, sort of unpack the actual policies here of extending support. Right? It's one thing to sort of, and I'm thinking specifically about military support. It's one thing to sell weaponry to an unstable regime. It's an entirely different thing when you start thinking about selling them or giving them designs for nuclear weapons, missile technology. So either you are actively doing this or assisting this process in some way. I'm just sort of curious. I mean, if you compare the U.S. record of support and to the Chinese record, this is qualitatively different in terms of. And the irony here is this: that the unintended consequence, perhaps, of proliferating this technology now has been that there is some sort of regime. There is, you can guarantee regime continuity because these regimes today have bombs, and I'm thinking North Korea, I'm thinking Pakistan, and that guarantee is not. It's not something that China has to spend money on, resources on. The U.S. is doing that. Right, so even though the U.S. worries about dealing with North Korea, it only has so many options on the table, and the Chinese have, in some ways, guaranteed regime survivability in these two countries. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I think I have to cut this off, don't I, Stephanie?
The next session starts at 11.
Oh, so you can actually answer the questions. And I'll just pile on this last question. Regardless of the details of the history of China and North Korea relations, I think in general, and this is to Eli in particular, I think in general there's a tendency to conflate three different things. One is economic relations without conditions, which China has with lots of regimes that we don't like. Actual arms sales to such regimes, especially if they're involved in civil wars, like arms sales to Zimbabwe at a terrible time, which is arguably worse still than the unconditional economic. And then outright assistance to regimes in their military development or their political struggles with their domestic opposition, which is probably even worse still from a U.S. perspective or from an EU perspective or from a Japanese perspective of regimes that we don't like. And I wonder if you're parsing those out when you talk about China's relations with these resource-rich areas in a sufficiently distinct way. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And as these papers were written as part of a longer research effort. Chris mentioned where he was looking to take the direction of his research. As part of the NARP fellowships this was meant to sort of gin up some ideas, present a paper, and in the remainder of the year we're meant to develop these ideas a little further. So I take this comment, and I think it's a good one, and it's something that I will certainly consider in terms of not just saying support for authoritarian regimes, but trying to parse out what those are, and while doing that, thinking about, is it wrong to draw analogies from the U.S. experience if the Chinese are doing it in a different way? And certainly, I think many in China believe they are. I guess the one pushback I would give to that is that it actually doesn't matter whether it's an economic relationship or an arms sale or outright assistance to the individual, to the political actors in the country who are potentially going to be using these types of support for political purposes. So I think part of the argument that I make in the paper is that if you look at what is emerging of sort of anti-Chinese sentiments, whether it's in Zambia, whether it's in Algeria, they're not making these distinctions. I think the type of political message that would rise to create some of these threats to China may not be as fine-grained. So I take this as a really good point. As an analyst, I will, it's exactly the kind of feedback I was hoping to get today. I will hope to separate those out, but I'm not sure at the end of the day they matter on the ground for the political forces that I'm considering.
Yeah, that's quite possible. I'm going to end it. It's been a great pleasure being the moderator for this excellent panel. And one of the great things about being a moderator for a great panel is you get to be on a great panel and do no work. And that was a real pleasure. Those presentations were terrific. The questions were good. The answers were good. And I just leave satisfied. So will you please thank the panelists for these.